Of progress or improvement. He who is making progress, having learned from philosophers that desire means of the desire of good things, and aversion means aversion from bad things, having learned too that happiness and tranquility are not attainable by a man otherwise than by not failing to obtain what he desires, and not falling into that which he should avoid. Such a man takes from himself desire altogether and confers it, but he employs his aversion only on things which are dependent on his will. For if he attempts to avoid anything independent of his will, he knows that sometimes he will fall into something which he wishes to avoid, and he will be unhappy. Now, if virtue promises good fortune and tranquility and happiness, certainly also progress towards virtue progresses towards each of these things. For if that it is also true that whichever point the perfecting of anything leads us, progress is an approach toward that point. How then do we admit that virtue is as such as I have said, and yet seek progress in other things and make a display of it? What is the product of virtue? Tranquility. Who then makes improvement? Is it he who has read many books of Chrysippus? But does virtue consist of having understood Chrysippus? If so, progress is clearly nothing else than a great deal of Chrysippus. But now then we admit that virtue produces one thing, and we declare that approaching near to it is another thing, namely, progress or improvement. Such a person, says one, is already able to read Chrysippus by himself. Indeed, sir, you are making great progress. What kind of progress? But why do you mock the man? Why do you draw him away from the perception of his own misfortunes? Will you not show him the effect of virtue that he may learn where to look for improvement? Seek it there, wretch, where your work lies. And where is your work? In desire and in aversion, that you may not be disappointed in your desire, and that you may fall into that which you would avoid, in pursuing and avoiding, that you commit no error, in assent and suspension of assent, that you will not be deceived. The first things and the most necessary are those which I have named. But if with trembling and lamenting you seek to not fall in that which you avoid, tell me how you are improving. Do you then show me that your improvements in these things? If I were talking to an athlete, I should say, show me your shoulders, and then he might say, here are my halteres. You and your halteres look to that. I should reply, I wish to see the effect of the halteres. So when you say, take the treatise on active powers, and how I have studied it, I have replied, slave, I am not inquiring about this, but how you exercise pursuit and avoidance, desire and aversion, and how you design and propose and prepare yourself, whether comfortably to nature or not. If conformably, you give me evidence of it, and I will say that you are making progress, but if not conformably, be gone, and not only expound your books, but write such books yourself. And what will you gain by it? Do you not know that the whole book costs only 5 denarii? Does then the expounder seem to be worth more than 5 denarii? Never then to look for the matter itself in one place and progress toward it in another. Where then is progress? If any of you, withdrawing from himself from externals, turns to his own will, to exercise it and improve it by labor, so as to make it conformable to nature, elevated, free, unrestrained, unimpeded, faithful, and modest. And if he has learned that he who desires or avoids the things which are not in his power can neither be faithful or free, but of necessity he must change them and be tossed about with them in his tempest, and of necessity must subject himself and others to have the power to procure or prevent what lie desires or would avoid, finally then he can rise in the morning, And if he observes and keeps these rules, bathes as a man of fidelity, eats as a modest man, and in like manner, if in every matter that occurs to works out his chief principles, as a runner does with reference to running, and the trainer of the voice with reference to the voice, then this is the man who truly makes progress, and this is the man who has not traveled in vain. But if he has strained his efforts to the practice of reading books, and labors only this, and has traveled for this, I tell him to return home immediately, and not to neglect his affairs there, for this is which he has traveled nothing. But the other thing is something, to study how a man can rid his life of lamenting and groaning, and saying, woe to me, and wretched that I am, and to rid this is also a misfortune and disappointment, and to learn what death is, and exile, and prison, and poison, that he may be able to say it when there he is in fetters, dear Crito. If it is in the will of gods that it be so, then let it be so, and not say, wretched am I, an old man, and have I kept my gray hairs for this? And who is it that speaks thus? Who do you think I shall name of some man of no repute or low condition? Does not Priam say this? Does not Oedipus say this? Nay, all kings say it. For what else tragedy than the perturbations of man who value externals exhibited by this kind of poetry? But if a man must learn by fiction that no external things which are independent of the will concerns us, for my part I shall like this fiction, by the aids of which I shall live happily and be undisturbed, but you must confer for yourselves what you wish. What then does Chrysippus teach us? Reply is, to know that these things are not false, from which happiness comes and tranquility arises. Take my books, and you will learn how true and conformable to nature these things are, which make me free from perturbations. O of great fortune, O great benefactor, who points out this way, to Triptolemus, all men who have erected temples and altars, because he has given us food and cultivation, but to him who discovers truth and brought it to light and communicated to all, not with the truth which show us to live, but how to live well. Who of you has this reason to build an altar or a temple or a dedicated statue, or who worships God for this? Because gods have a given the vine, or wheat, or sacrifice to them, but because they have produced in the human mind that fruit by which they design to show us the truth which relates to happiness. Shall we not thank God for this? So this one was an intense chapter of progress and improvement, and it's so dense. This one chapter alone was a whole paragraph. Like this whole thing was one paragraph. That's why I took no breaths when I did it. And it makes the very, very powerful argument that if you're a person that just studies in college, if you're like a book nerd, you're not really improving. You can't say that because you read more that your life is somehow better than somebody else until you apply it. And that's why they compare the book reader, the person that studies, to the athlete. The athlete is someone that actively shows externally his improvements. And you could say that's artificial, but it's not really. And what is stopping from doing both? Why can't you improve your brain muscle and your physical body structure? And so this is saying apply it, and really apply it so that you can see improvements. Where he asked the athlete, let me see your shoulders. That's the difference between, hey, what do you know? You know, a person could bullshit their way into doing something. Like an example is, I used to attend Job Corps with this one individual who didn't take the physical labor jobs that I took. I took carpentry and automotive because those were subjects that I knew the least about and struggled with. What I did was challenged myself. How can I improve myself in these things that I'm the weakest in? And so in Job Corps, it was based on self-progress. And I had this 600-page book of these manuals, how to use the tools, which angles, what I'm supposed to do, build sawhorses, build walls, build roofs, build trusses, the measurement tape, how to use a plumb, applying Pythagorean theorem to make a wall. Algebra and all those things I struggled in class, but these were applicable real life scenarios where you would use geometry. And so this wall behind me, I built this stubs, and we put stubs every 6 feet as standard. So I did all of that. I had that experience and I did it, and I felt really proud that I made this. And this used to be a living room, it's now it's now like a room. Taking automotive class was a bigger challenge than carpentry, because in carpentry it was everyday hands-on these things. Whereas in college, and I love going to school and I love studying, and obviously I'm a nerd, I'm reading this, a wall is way easier than trying to wrap your head around how fast an engine piston spins inside the engine, and learning about the oil rings in the piston, learning about the composition of the piston, learning about how combustion affects the piston, how air ratio to fuel ratio, how that affects the engine, how hot the engine can get, why you need to put oil in the engine, why there's a radiator system in the engine. I mean, we had a book, we were reading chapters, but it's hard to imagine what that is or what that looks like. So then they would provide additional links, like howitworks.com was a big source. They would have some GIFs of cutouts of two-dimensional drawings about how the pistons go up and down, and how this camshaft just spins, and it's got these weights that are different sizes and lengths, and then they're placed in different parts on this rod called the camshaft, which the pistons are connected to, so that everyone spins and pushes up in different synchronized times in relation to the combustion. So all of this complicated in an engine happens thousands and thousands of times in 1 minute. In 1 minute. All of this precision happens thousands and thousands of times in 1 minute. And humans built this technology even before we landed on the moon. And there was a statistic that we heard in class where a car in 1997 had more advanced electronics and gadgets than the rockets that took the astronauts to the moon. You apply what you know, and now I know so much about vehicles. And the example is, I had all this technical expert knowledge, but I can't get a job at any of these places, where the person that I used to know, he bullshitted himself into working at Apple, into working at high-tech companies, and possibly doesn't even know how to make a website. Possibly doesn't even know how his phone works, his iPhone. Possibly doesn't even know the technical mechanics of how electricity travels in electric components. You know, I learned all this stuff throughout my life, and I was able to bring my car back from the dead several times. I've done major repairs by myself. With all of this stuff, I have more hands-on experience than that person, but he was still able to climb up the corporate ladder faster than me. He was a white guy. Because words are cheap. What are you able to prove? I can say all these things, but what am I able to prove to them? Well, I don't know, because they never even give me the opportunity to prove anything to them. So that's the flaw and the bias. And for me, I think it's more of a bias because my name is 5 names long, and any individual like that could easily be judged just on the basis of that. Whether or not that is the actual scenario or the situation is hard to say, but I wasn't even given the opportunity, so it's hard to say whether I'd be completely competent or not, or whether I would even replace my supervisor. I really recommend this book. It's amazing. It's mind-blowing. Like, subscribe, share.